But the person that loses a debate about the most important things in life learns something. And so they benefit the most. The irony is, you should want to lose debates about the most important things in life. You might actually gain thereby and learn something. And that, I think, is typically ironic, typically parody. That's Socrates in a nutshell, buddy. That's all you need to know about the guy. I could have saved you an hour and a half. Aye.
Donald, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me onto the show. I'm looking forward to it. Why are you wearing a tie?
Well, am I not allowed to wear a tie?
You're the first podcaster I've ever spoken to that's wearing a tie for the interview.
You see, it just shows how much reverence and respect I have.
Yeah. It's more kind of smart casual these days with the podcasters, I find. If that, I was interviewed by a guy once, and he had to stand up at one point, and I could see that he was wearing pajama bottoms.
Donald, I can assure you that I am not wearing.
You're not wearing pajama bottoms. Okay, I'll take your word for that.
Well, the thing is, with the suit, is I had a run of speaking to Savile Row tailors and menswear.
Right.
The thing is, with the suit, I find it actually so much easier to wear because you just wait, I've got a recording today, I'll put on a suit. Which tie should I wear? You're just done. You don't need to think about anything else.
Right. Mate, that makes sense. Is that a special tie that you've got on? What sort of tie is it?
It's just a striped.
Just a generic striped tie.
Generic striped tie. It's actually my dad's. I nicked it from him about 5 years
someone else's tie.
He doesn't know. But do you know who didn't wear a tie? Was Socrates.
Socrates didn't wear a tie. People think that he was kind of scruffy. But Plato says that when he needed to, he could dress up smart. He was known for going around barefoot in Athens. There's a really good TV drama called Barefoot in Athens with a very, very young Christopher Walken playing Socrates' son. You can find it on YouTube. And Peter Ustinov plays Socrates. He's a perfect Socrates, I think. And he was known for going barefoot. But I'll tell you something funny about Socrates. I'll tell you a little anecdote. There was a legend that Socrates was besties with a guy called Simon, who otherwise known as Simon the Shoemaker, because he owned a cobbler's shop in the Agora. And Socrates would hang out there and talk about philosophy. That's he liked to hang out in the mornings. He'd hang out in shops. And historians thought, this sounds made up. It sounds like typical ancient BS, right? It's probably from a satire or something, because a guy that's known for not wearing shoes hanging out in a shoe shop just sounds like you're spinning as a yarn, right? And some of his followers didn't wear shoes either. So this guy must have been thinking, my shop's full of guys that don't even wear shoes. And I'm trying to make a living here selling shoes. Simon was reputedly the first person to write Socratic dialogues. Most people know that Plato wrote a lot of dialogues. We have all of them. We have 37-ish, of give or take. There's one or two we're not sure about if they were written by Plato or not. And we also have about 40-odd short dialogues by Xenophon, another of Socrates' students. But there were reputedly about 10 of Socrates' followers immediately after his death who began teaching a version of his philosophy. There were 10 Socratic sects, and many of them wrote dialogues. And some of those dialogues were famous, but are lost now. Apart from a chunk by a guy called Aeschines, we've got a chunk of one of his dialogues that survives today. But we've got nothing from Simon the Shoemaker. He was the first person to begin doing this, and the other ones copied. He was the OG author of Socratic dialogues, but they're all gone now. And he based it on sitting in his shoe shop. He probably never said anything. He's just sitting there mending shoes silently, taking it all in. And then afterwards, he's like, I'm going to write this down, make a name for myself as an author of Socratic dialogues. And so people thought this sounds made up, right? But then when they were excavating the Agora, they found a lot of little shops, and they found one as they excavated it, they found a bunch of iron nails that are used by cobblers. And they're like, this looks like a shoe shop. And then they found a little bit of ceramic. It's the base of what's called a calyx or a wine cup. It's a pretty common find in archaeology in Greece. But usually people, or often, they'll engrave their name on the bottom of a calyx. And they pulled this fragment out of the ground and it had the name Simon scratched on it. So I like to imagine that the archaeologist that found that must have been thinking, you guys are having me on. Like, someone's planted this here, haven't they? What's the chances we're going to pull a thing, one little fragment out of the ground has got the guy's name written on it in a shoe shop? Like, I mean, I thought this was baloney. Like, but apparently this is one of the unusual cases where archaeological evidence matches up with the literary record. Like, because often we read things in ancient histories and we think that doesn't really sound plausible, it might not be reliable. A lot of our sources are derived from satirical plays, funnily enough. For example, a lot of what we know about Diogenes the Cynic probably comes from satirical plays. We don't really know whether to believe it or not. It's maybe more like legend than reality. But in this case, there's some evidence that was dug up out of the ground that seems to verify it.
Is there archaeological evidence for Socrates? You know, is there a pinpoint of, this was his childhood home, this was, where?
Not really. We don't know for sure where he was put on trial and executed, but it could have been a number of locations. There's a place called Socrates' prison that's in the what's called the Philopapus hill beside the Acropolis, but it's not real. It's just like a cave that tourists go to, and it has a big sign outside it saying the prison of Socrates, but then in small print underneath it, it says, like, probably not though. Like, we don't think this actually was the prison. It's a slightly confusing Greek, like, Ministry of Culture, this thing. But we think he was probably put on trial and executed in the Agora. A lot went on in the Agora, like, so apparently, the main courtroom and the prison, it was a pretty small prison, were in the Agora. So we sort of know where that is. When they dug up the prison, they also did find something kind of eerie. They found a little statuette that looks like it's probably meant to be Socrates. By the way, this bit of the calyx and this little statuette are in the museum in the Agora. There's a building called the Stoa of Attalus that people sometimes confuse with the Stoa Poikile. Like, it's in Greece, they don't usually make replica buildings. Like, they prefer to preserve the original archaeology. But this is one of the main exceptions, is they built a replica of an ancient Athenian Stoa, and it houses historical artifacts that were dug up in the Agora. It's in the Agora. So you go in there, you'll find this little fragment that clearly has the name Simon scratched on it. And then this little statuette that looks like it's probably Socrates. And by the way, the reason that we're not totally sure is that, first of all, this is interesting. Everything about Socrates is paradoxical, right? But Socrates looks nothing like most Athenians, right? Because mainly the Athenians were interested in making statues of attractive young men. Like, they were kind of fixated on the male form, basically, and the ideal of athleticism and stuff. And Socrates was not like that. Like, so the Athenians often describe him as being like the ugliest, pot-bellied, balding, snub-nosed, boggle-eyed kind of guy in Athens. Plato says that he had a face like a torpedo fish. Xenophon says he had eyes like a crab. Plato says he walks like a pelican. And these are his friends, like, describing him, right? Basically, there's a joke in Xenophon's Symposium. He has a joke with them about how he thinks he would win a beauty contest, and they'll roll about laughing. And he says, "But I have inner beauty, and you guys don't, and that's more important. So I should win the beauty contest." And this seems to be something that has them all kind of like in a drunken state, rolling about laughing, basically, right? So you don't normally see statues of a guy like Socrates because he doesn't meet this kind of stereotype of the physical ideal in Athens, with one exception. And Plato mentions it. There's a character in Greek, I forgot what his name is, in Greek theatre. And generally in Greek theatre, the comedy characters look like Socrates. And there's one in particular They thought, you look like this comedy character, like that we have this kind of pot-bellied, bearded old man, right, that everybody laughs at. This is a big feature of Socrates in ancient Athens. In many ways, he seems to them to resemble a buffoon, like a clown in satirical theatre. Funnily, I don't mean that they actually thought he was like that as a philosopher, but there was something about him. He was like, you look like this caricature. That's the reason that we can't recognize statues. On the one hand, he should be easily recognizable, except for the fact that statues often resemble statues of cliched comedy characters. So it could be this little statuette is from a Greek theatre or something like that, and it's meant to just resemble. If you go to, there's a theatre called the Theatre of Dionysus on the slopes of the Acropolis, and there's a frieze, like there's some sculpture that's difficult to see, but from around the back of it you can see it, and it was made later during the Roman period. There's a character that looks like Socrates, but it's probably not meant to be him. Like it's meant to be this theatrical stereotype character, right? His name I've temporarily forgotten. But let's assume this little statue actually is Socrates, right? The odd thing about that is those little statuettes would sometimes be put in a small shrine, like a household shrine, right? And so we don't know. We can only speculate. But it's tempting to think. The Athenians often did stuff and then regretted it afterwards, right? And it is tempting to think they executed him, and then generations later they were like, man, I wish we had done that. And created like a little shrine with a little statuette, like commemorating his death in the prison where he was executed, because that's where they found it. Like, who knows? But yeah, that's another like odd thing that they found there. But other than that, the archaeological evidence for Socrates' life is kind of limited. You know, obviously we can find some places that he mentions or we can recognize geographically. There's actually the one bit of trivia is there's a young man that Socrates has a dialogue with called the Lysis, and we have what we believe is his funerary stone, like dedicated to him. So he's like 15 or something in the dialogue, but you know, we have this thing that commemorates him as an old man. Like, so that's like a kind of direct connection to the life of Socrates. But other than that, we're not really going to find much. So to dig a thing out of the ground that's like, no, there actually was a shoemaker, like, you know, whose shop, I guess, was full of guys that went around barefoot all day.
So before Socrates used to hang out with shoemakers, he would hang out with soldiers because he himself was a soldier, but also a stonemason. And stonemasonry is actually like seriously hard work. And if we looked at other influential figures in relation to manual labor, we could look at, say, Virgil's love of farming, or Cleanthes being the water carrier, or even Jesus reportedly being a carpenter. Do you think there's a correlation between the hard labor taxing the body, but also allowing space for deeper thought?
In the ancient world, philosophy was associated with leisure. So it was assumed that, you know, you couldn't really be an intellectual and do physical labor. And it was kind of frowned on, in a sense. It was considered to be a kind of low-class thing to work with your hands. So we believe, if we can trust the sources, that Socrates was originally a stonemason and a sculptor. He must have been working alongside slaves, probably owned by his family. But then he abandoned that life, as far as we can tell, and embraced a life of leisure. Now, it's always been a kind of enigma how he managed to do that and support himself. But there's a kind of hint that he was he became supported financially by one of his best friends, Crito, who was very wealthy. We're told that there's a passage that says he removed Socrates from the workshop, like that he was working in. Like, he probably became his patron and said, "Hey, I'll support you. I'll buy you a house or whatever. Like, don't worry about it. Like, I'll look after you, and you just go and do philosophy all day, every day." That allowed him to do that. But most Athenians were soldiers. They had a citizen army. And Socrates was a veteran of 3 major battles, even to like relatively late in his life ish. I mean, he was like 48 or something like that when he fought in the last major battle that we hear about, which is, you know, not unusual in ancient Athens, but it's kind of like pushing it a little bit. Like he was probably starting to get out of breath a little bit, like in the phalanx, like alongside the young guys. Like he's pushing 50. I mean, like, you know, running up a hill with a shield and a spear and all that. Like it was probably getting a little bit tougher for him, like as he approached 50. But he must have been reasonably fit. Like, and so, you know, these caricatures of Socrates as a pot. Some people say Armand Dangour is a classicist. He wrote a book called Socrates in Love recently. That's one of my favorite books about Socrates. And he talks about this idea that Socrates may have, you know, we think of him as a sort of old guy with a beard and a pot belly, but he was like 71 or 72 when he was put on trial. So Plato mainly knew Socrates in the last like decade of his life, roughly. So he would have known him as an older guy. Like if Plato had seen Socrates when he was like in the prime of his life, maybe he would have perceived him as a, you know, a more handsome, physically fit dude. Like the other odd thing that I think there's certain things that classicists seem to me to go into in incredible depth, and then there's other things that sometimes they kind of gloss over a little bit. And one of them is that Socrates is consistently portrayed as talking on very informal terms with Athenian generals and, you know, the officer class. And Xenophon portrays Socrates going into a lot of detail about military training, strategy, and tactics. And some people go, that's just Xenophon. He's an Athenian general. He's putting all this stuff into Socrates' mouth, maybe. But I'm not so sure. You know, I think, you know, Plato also portrays Socrates talking to generals. You know, he was a veteran until he was maybe approaching 50, still serving, actively serving in the military, in the phalanx. I think Socrates might not have been an ordinary soldier. I think he may have been like the Greek equivalent of a centurion, like a sergeant major. You know, he's a kind of mediator between the grunts, you know, like the hoplites, and the officer class, it seems. You know, comfortable. He knows about, he doesn't just go and fight, but he's actually studied military training, strategy, and tactics, and is able to kind of talk on an equal footing with the officer class about these things. So he seems to me kind of like a little bit like a centurion or a sergeant major, possibly.
When he was in the army, his fellow soldiers focused a lot on, say, the accumulation of wealth or fame, which was much to his bemusement. Given that the modern world is so focused on the two things, say, wealth and fame, what would Socrates' advice be for us when fighting, say, materialism and the hedonic treadmill?
What would he advise about the pursuit of wealth and fame? If Socrates was alive today, he would think, you know, we're probably more obsessed with wealth and fame than the typical ancient Athenian was. We get, I think the main thing that would strike Socrates, actually, if you wanted to hear a load of BS and subject yourself to brainwashing in ancient Athens, you had to leave the house. Like, so you'd have to walk across town to the Pnyx, where the assembly met, and there you'd hear politicians giving speeches, right? Or you go to one of the gymnasia outside the city walls of Athens, which people frequently used to hang out in, and maybe you'd hear a sophist declaiming there, right? And that had a big impact on Athenian society. But, you know, if you're like doing your gardening or whatever, or pottering about in your stonemason's workshop, you're not really subjected to rhetoric, propaganda, and political oratory that much. But Socrates, I think, would, if he could see modern society, he'd think, wow, you guys have invited the politicians into your houses, and the sophists you carry around in your pocket everywhere you go, because you're connected to the internet and your mobile phones and your, you know, even, I mean, radio, the transistor radio was bad enough, right? invited politicians into our kitchen, like, but then television and the internet, you guys are now subjecting yourself to propaganda 24/7. Like everywhere you go, it's in your house, you've got multiple devices beaming rhetoric, advertising, political propaganda into your brains. Like, so he would think we're exposing ourselves far more than people in the ancient world ever did to rhetoric. And he'd see that as one of the main reasons that we're all brainwashed into pursuing values that no one in their right mind actually really believes in when they're lying in their deathbed. No one in their deathbed sits there and thinks, man, I wish I'd just earned a bit more money before I croak. Like, no one in their deathbed thinks, gosh, if only I wish I'd been like a bit more famous, like during the course of my life. If I could turn back the clock, that's what I would prioritize. Like, I think most people are, maybe with some exceptions, right? But the majority of people are smart enough when they're given the opportunity to really reflect on their life, to realize that wealth and fame are kind of pseudo goals. Like, they don't really constitute true flourishing or happiness. And people pursue them beyond a certain level anyway, because like they're brainwashed through celebrity culture and consumerism and stuff like that, into believing that these things are all important. I think it's because we can't mind read. Like, one puzzling question is, why is it that throughout the whole of human history we've made virtually zero progress, like since the time of Socrates, in terms of actually getting ourselves out of this mess, and countering this basic error that we all make generation after generation? We all fall into the same trap that people in the ancient world fell into. How come we're not out of it? People keep challenging it. Socrates challenged it, very dramatically. Great religious leaders and philosophers throughout the ages challenge it, but we all ignore them and just go straight back to the consumerism and celebrity culture over and over again. Why is that? Is it something innate? Is it how our brains are wired? I think it's because we can't mind read. I think it's when you're born. Do you remember when you were born and you're toddling around?
I actually don't remember when I was born.
Like, do you remember when everything was made of wood before the internet? Like, so you're in your little baby and you're toddling. I've got a baby at the moment. Like, and you can't use language. You can't really question anything. You're looking around, kind of trying to get some sort of sense of what you're meant to be doing. So you just copy stuff, right? Babies do monkey see, monkey do. They just emulate, like, what they see adults doing, basically, And what do you see adults doing? You see them pursuing wealth and status all around you as you're growing up as a kid, right? So, of course, you're going to think, maybe that's what life is all about. It's what everyone else seems to be doing. They're going on and on about it all the time. So it's no surprise in that regard. But then if you sat down and you asked them, they'd be like, well, I'm just trying to look after my family. But, ultimately, I mean, these things are superficial, right? But that's not what you see on the outside. On the outside, all you see is people spending all the time, all day long, every day, trying to pursue, like, when they're not at the grind, like, trying to make a few bucks, they're on the internet trying to impress people, like, or shooting their mouths off about things, like trying to sound intelligent, So we spend our whole lives kind of revolving around things like wealth, status, trying to impress other people, trying to acquire things. And if you ask most people, they'd admit that that's not really what life is about. But that's what kids see generation after generation. And that's what they start to emulate. And by the time they've acquired language and self-awareness, they start to question it, it's kind of too late. They're already committed to pursuing all of these goals. It's kind of become ingrained and habitual. I think that's why generation after generation, we need to look back to guys like Socrates that radically questioned it. Socrates, I mean, I'll relate the argument. One of the most important arguments, I think, that's in Plato's dialogues, because it's very simple. Socrates asks a young guy called Euthydemus, actually, that's one of his friends, what what constitutes flourishing, basically. He says, what constitutes good fortune? And the guy that he's talking to says, well, that's easy. People usually think Socrates begins with a stupid question that's like a no-brainer, right? A lot of people thought Socrates was an idiot and they would say, you ask these stupid questions about, like, sheep and carpenters and things like that, like you're just a weird old dude. And often the dialogues begin like that. So Socrates will say, well, what constitutes good fortune? And this guy's like, well, having a lot of money, a big house, like being born into a noble family that's got a lot of status, having lots of friends and powerful play, stuff like that, right? And Socrates says, what about like wisdom and virtue and stuff like that? And his friends, well, those are important as well, right? And Socrates says, well, that kind of makes sense. Those are the things that people pursue. But hang on a minute. What if you took a big pile of money and you gave it to somebody who's wise and virtuous? I guess they would use it to do wise and virtuous things. But if you took that big pile of money and gave it to somebody who was foolish and vicious, wouldn't they just use it to do foolish and vicious things? If you gave that big pile of money to a vicious dictator, like, would he use it to commit genocide or torture his political opponents or something like that? And, surely then money is only as good or bad as the use that you make of it. It gives you control. It's more like an opportunity or an external or practical advantage. But it's not intrinsically good or bad. And his interlocutor says, well, I see your point, Socrates. Maybe it's neither good nor bad, but what matters is whether you use it wisely or foolishly. Socrates says that's true of all the other external advantages that you just mentioned, though. Like even health, status, noble family, all of those things really just give you more opportunity in life and, allow you to extend your control over your environment. And whether that's good or bad would depend on your character and the use that you make of it. So then the only thing that's really good is wisdom, like in knowing how to use everything else. And the only thing that's really bad would be moral ignorance, like having a vicious character and stuff like that, like having a bad character and not knowing how to use things well. And an even deeper level, suppose you deprived someone of these things. Like suppose they were poor and they were maligned by other people and surrounded by enemies. A wise person, a foolish person would struggle in that situation, but a wise person might even benefit from it. A wise person might even flourish in the face of adversity. They might become stronger, more resilient as a result. They might learn from the experience. Now, Socrates was relatively poor for someone of his class anyway, and he was put on trial and executed. He was surrounded by people that ridiculed him. So a question that later generations asked themselves would be, would Socrates' life have been improved if we gave him more money and he had more friends, and a better reputation? Isn't it part of what made him great that he was broke and surrounded by people that hated him and that he exercised wisdom and self-discipline and courage in the face of adversity? If we just removed those obstacles, how would we actually have made his life better? Ultimately, it's ironically, someone who's got strength of character flourishes even when they're deprived of external advantages. But it requires wisdom and strength of character to use those advantages well. There's a saying in Stoicism that the wise man needs nothing but uses everything well, whereas the fool needs many, many things and uses all of them badly.
And, for example, Stoicism, it boasts temperance, and Socrates would boast the merits of a similar quality. But if we look at, say, the other emotions, which are potentially less virtuous, anger, rage, lust, etc., there is so much human achievement which has been as a result of channeling those emotions. Buildings built, bridges erected, etc.
Yeah.
If they all instead channeled it and made it into temperance or self-control, would they all be indifferent and even a bit vanilla? Would we be lacking as a human race?
We'd become boring. It doesn't mean that they're good. I absolutely agree with you that anger and lust and greed have allowed people to achieve many good things. So is stupidity, you know? Like, there are good things that come out of like our mistakes and our folly. That's part of the paradox of life. I mean, there's no vice or stupidity so wretched that it hasn't at some point in history resulted in some kind of fortuitous outcome. You know, I mean, there are idiots out there that have saved their nations, like uh, it, and there are people out there of great integrity and wisdom who have led people into disaster. Like because you can never guarantee the outcome of actions. And even, like the cliche, even a stopped clock is right twice a day. I mean, even someone who's really greedy and foolish might get lucky, or the people that have to live with them might be lucky that what they do actually works to their benefit. But you can't depend on that. I mean, generally speaking, I think we want our leaders to be wise, temperate, courageous, and show the virtues that we admire. And that's generally that works out in our favor, but not always. Like, there are good things. I think part of what Socrates would say is that the vices are unpredictable. Like, sometimes they work in your favor, but sometimes they can backfire and lead to problems. Sometimes vices lead to short term. I mean, Socrates is very into this idea that if you're just talking, if by success you mean external outcomes, right? They're always partly in the hands of fate. There are many variables that are unknown. Do you win a battle or lose it? Does your economy flourish or does it collapse? Like, these are things that are kind of sometimes difficult to predict for certain, right? There could be surprises. There are many surprises in life and many reversals of fortune, and Socrates was very into the idea, as many Greeks were, that what seems like a catastrophe or a setback can sometimes work out to be in your favor in the long term. And sometimes what seems like a great victory, the Greeks loved this irony that often what seems like a success or a victory can ultimately destroy you. Like, history is full of reversals of fortune when we look back on it. I mean, one of his famous examples was Socrates said that when at the end of the Peloponnesian War, the Spartans defeated the Athenians, they put a military junta in control of Athens called the 30 Tyrants. And, they killed a lot of people. They killed like 3,000 people. They were like torturing people, seizing their assets and things like that. And Socrates used to say, and this probably annoyed people, but he would say to the people in Athens who were poor and lacked any status in society, you guys used to complain a lot about how poor you were and how you had no influence or status. But all the rich and influential people are rounded up by the 30 tyrants, garroted and thrown in a pit so they could seize their asset. You're like, you guys are the only ones that got off scot-free. Like, so you're thanking your lucky stars now, like, that you're poor and anonymous, like, because it's worked out to be in your favor. There are many paradoxes like that throughout history. I mean, the obvious one that we can think of today is when somebody wins the lottery. Like, the worst thing that happens to them. Now they're suddenly surrounded by hangers-on, and they don't know how to deal with that. Like, and maybe they blow all their money on drugs, like, and other vices that kind of destroy them. So what seems like good luck can become bad luck, and what seems like bad luck can become good luck. If you're old enough and wise enough, you can look back in your life, maybe just about, like, and look at the overall trajectory of it and think, maybe some of the best things that ever happened to me seemed at the time like setbacks. When a relationship breaks up, it always seems like a big catastrophe. But your relationships have to end, otherwise you wouldn't be able to go on and form new relationships. Your first wife has to divorce you so that you can meet your second wife. Like, and you look back on it, you might think, well, that seemed really terrible at the time, but I'm a lot happier now. Or remember that time I got sacked from my job or I was made redundant or whatever? Like, that seemed really bad at the time. But then I was able to set up a business, or I retrained and ended up doing something else that I'm much happier doing. When you look at the bigger picture, it's difficult to know. So Socrates actually would respond by saying, we shouldn't be too hasty, like to jump to conclusions about what constitutes success or failure in terms of externals. But there's something else that I'd like to add, about this, because I think it's very pertinent today. Socrates said, first of all, Socrates was famous for saying all the virtues are one. Someone isn't really wise if they lack courage and they lack temperance. And I mean, today we think of people, a lot of people want to develop self-discipline and think of themselves as developing confidence or courage. But Socrates would say you can't exercise self-discipline or courage or other virtues unless you also acquire wisdom. Like, the virtues can't be separated. Like, self-discipline isn't virtuous unless it's also accompanied by wisdom and other good traits. They all have to be combined, basically. But in one of Xenophon's dialogues, Socrates says in particular that political leaders who lack temperance are highly problematic, right? And that would apply to many. I mean, some people admire the impulsiveness and the recklessness of certain politicians today. And they don't think it's really a big deal, right? But Socrates would say, but people who lack self-discipline, even if you think they're wise and statesmanlike, even if you think they're a good leader, they're going to be unreliable because they're going to be easily tempted, bribed, swayed, manipulated by other people. And he engages in a whole dialogue with his interlocutor to say to them, to get them to the point where they recognize that a leader has to have self-discipline, even if you think they've got other good qualities. Those other qualities are going to be inconsistent, unless they also possess temperance and self-discipline. Self-discipline is what allows us to exercise wisdom and justice consistently. Otherwise, otherwise it's more dangerous, because we might elect somebody who seems really wise and just, but once they get into power, they suddenly get corrupted really easily because they're bribed. There's a lot of money swirling around them, right? And if they lack temperance and self-discipline, we might think, oh, we can trust this guy. He seems really wise and just. Now suddenly he's changed, right? And that comes as a big shock because we weren't ready for it, right? But Socrates says that's why you need to look for leaders that possess these other. Don't forget, they also need to have self-discipline and temperance. It's a really bad idea to put people in a position of power who lack those qualities, right? If he was here today, he'd be like, oh man, what did I tell you guys about not electing people that lack any temperance and self-discipline? You didn't listen to a word I said.
But if someone was listening and say, oh, well, that's very good. I am on a journey for self-discipline, temperance. But I obviously, as Socrates says, needs to get wisdom first. How does one go about accumulating wisdom?
Well, I used to talk to my daughter a lot about philosophy. She's 13 now, but I started talking to her about philosophy when she was 2 or 3 years old or something like that. I thought you have to start them young, right? And I tell her, I used to ask, I'd ask her what constitutes wisdom. And she'd be like, I don't know. But I'd ask her these characters in a movie, right? I'd say, is Spider-Man wise? Or is he unwise? Is the Green Goblin wise? Which of these characters in the movie are more wise and less wise? I think one of the most important questions, no one ever asks you how you define wisdom. It's one of the most important questions to ask. And I say to her, do you know how Socrates became wise? And she'd be like, I don't know. And I'd say, he asked lots of questions about the most important things in life, and he listened really carefully to the answers, basically. That's where he started. He spoke to people a lot. What did Socrates do all day long? He talked to people. What did he talk to them about? The weather? The scores in the football? Or the wrestling or whatever. It would be horse racing, chariot racing. What's the latest results in the chariot racing, right? He didn't have those conversations. He talked to them about the nature of justice and the nature of wisdom. So Socrates made an effort to talk to people as often as he could, and a wide variety of people, about the things that he considered the most important things in life. We don't do that, right? We do the opposite. We engage in facile conversations. We spend our whole life, doing stuff that's kind of a distraction from our true purpose, our true goal in many cases. And then we get hit by a bus and we die, right? Or at some point we have a wake-up call. So we nearly get hit by a bus. So we nearly die. And we think, holy cow, what am I doing with my life? Maybe I shouldn't be working in this paperclip factory. Or even if I do, maybe in the evenings I should be writing poetry or doing something that's kind of a little bit more meaningful and fulfilling. Maybe I shouldn't play computer games all day and smoke weed, right? Just thought, unless somehow you can make that serve a higher purpose. If no one sits on their deathbed and thinks, I wish I'd spent more time playing computer games and smoking weed before I die. If only I could extend my life by a few more days, I'd be able to play more computer games and smoke more weed. It sounds absurd.
Spoken like a true Scot.
Yeah. So there's got to be more to life than this, right? I think we have to sometimes come to terms with our own mortality, contemplate our own mortality. Sometimes that happens because we have a brush with death. Brushes with death are more common than people realize. As you get older, it's more likely. It might be that you have a health scare. That happens as you get older. Once you pass 50, 60, every so often you think, I thought I was having a heart attack there. Or something like that, right? The doctor says something that freaks you out. Man, I thought it was a goner. Or you do dangerous stuff. I don't know how dangerous cycling is. I'm guessing maybe occasionally you nearly ride off the edge of a cliff or something like that. I thought it was a goner there. When I was a kid, there were at least 3 or 4 times when I thought I was toast. Usually, there were 3 times when I thought I was going to drown. This was before helicopter parenting was a thing. My parents just let me play in building sites and things like that, right? Maybe they were trying to get rid of me, but I think it was the norm back then, There were at least 3 occasions where I thought I was going to drown. I was swept out to sea or partially, on the Virgin or so twice. And then I kind of got swept down a river once, the River Aire, when I used to play in the water.
I kind of got swept by the river once, maybe.
Yeah. Yeah. And then you're for a minute there, I thought it was toast. But when you have a brush with death, and there are people in dangerous professions like the military, where they have exposure to situation where they start to think, maybe this is it, maybe my number's up. But the other thing is that if you, as time goes on, you're bereaved. Your friends start dying, and your parents die, your grandparents die, and these are all wake-up calls to contemplate our own mortality, right? And to start questioning our values and how the things that you spend most of your time doing, really the things that you prize most highly in life. That's what Socrates would spend his time talking to people about each day. And that's what he would think we should be doing is, at the very trying to clarify what our values actually are. I mean, Plato's dialogues are extensive and they explore different facets of virtue. But it seems to me the central question that Socrates wants to answer. And funnily enough, in one of Xenophon's dialogues, somebody just asks him, where should you begin doing philosophy? Because if you look at all the literature that comes down to, it's kind of all over the place a little bit. That they're discussing a lot of different things. There's a young guy that asks Socrates, where should you begin? And he says, basically, he says, do you know the difference between what's good and bad? What he's driving at is he's asking him if he understands what the goal of life is. Do you know what's ultimately good? What's intrinsically good? What is it that you should be trying to fundamentally pursue in life? He's asking him really to reflect on and define what the Greeks called the telos, or the goal of life. We could call it the meaning of life or the purpose of life, right? That's what people should be talking about, But they don't tend to do it in pubs and bars in Scotland, like, except occasionally, right? But sometimes, honestly, like, the place where you might hear people occasionally talking about some of these things is in a podcast. Sometimes.
Look at us doing our bit.
We're getting into it right now. We're asking we're saying the unsayable. We're asking the imponderable questions. Like, what's the point of all this stuff? Like, life. One day you're going to be dead. It might be tomorrow. It might be any minute now. You could get hit by a meteorite, right? It could be it might be true. Maybe in 20 years' time, we're all going to be wiped out or made obsolete by AI, perhaps. I think that's unlikely. But, some people think, oh, there's like a 10% chance, there's like a 10% chance we might all be dead in 20 years' time or something like that. Could be. You could drop dead any minute. So, the heat is on. We need to think how we're using our life. You only get one opportunity. Is it really the stuff that you spend your time doing all day that's most important? And if you're like, I don't know what I'm meant to be doing, I just stumbled into this. I looked around, everyone else seems to be obsessed with celebrity culture and consumerism. I'm starting to question that, then the next step just is to try and figure out what the goal of life is. And you do that by talking to other people about it. Socrates said, the famous Greek maxim is gnothyseauton, that was engraved in the pillar outside the temple of Apollo at Delphi. It means know thyself. And it's the kind of slogan, almost like a Zen koan, that permeates Greek philosophy. Socrates referred to it frequently. Apparently, he loved the saying. He wanted to try and understand what it meant. There's a dialogue called the First Alcibiades, where by one of Plato's Socratic dialogues, where they discuss know thyself. And Socrates says, he compares it to an eye that sees itself. To know thyself would be to attain a kind of wisdom. Socrates says it would be like an eye that could see itself. As how to know how does the mind know itself? He says it's like Apollo is instructing the eye to see itself. He says to Alcibiades, how would an eye see itself? And Alcibiades is like, I don't know, Socrates, I guess in a mirror or something like that. And Socrates is like, yeah, smart kid, you're right. But how does the mind know itself? What's the best mirror for the human soul? And what he's implying is that the best mirror for a human soul would be another human being that we're engaged in a sincere dialogue with. Because he rightly understood that our biggest problem is a type of ignorance that's ingrained in us. Like, just as the eye has a blind spot, you can't see your own eye unless you look in a mirror, right? Or you see your reflection. And like a camera cannot see itself unless it's pointed at a mirror. But he didn't have the language to articulate it, but that's what we call a blind spot today. He's referring to a blind spot in our field of vision, like a blind spot of the sort that a camera has. Our mind has blind spots. We have cognitive biases. How do we ever gain objectivity? There's research that shows that we exercise more wisdom when we're looking at the problems of other people than when we're analysing our own problems. There's a researcher called Igor Grossman at the University of Waterloo in Canada who runs a wisdom centre researching wisdom, and he's demonstrated empirically that people are better at solving the problems of strangers than they are at solving their own problems, like relationship problems, other types of problems as well, because we exhibit greater objectivity, greater mental flexibility, more open-mindedness when we're considering the problems of other people. Like, we're biased as hell, like, when we try to solve our own problems. So we're rubbish at, we're like 30% better, or roughly, when it comes to reasoning about other people's problems. But if we engage in a dialogue with other people, and if I try to help you with your problems, then I might start to think, maybe I do some of the things that Joe does. Like, I'm sitting here talking to Joe, like, about his relationship problems or his career, And I mean, I think he's made some stupid decisions, to be honest. Like, he seems a little bit short-sighted, like maybe he's jumping to certain, and then I might think, maybe I do that too. Like, maybe everyone does that. And so by helping other people to reflect on and question their values, like to reappraise their goals, like Socrates did all day long, like we can help ourselves by helping other people, right? I can help you more objectively, 30% better at doing it than I would be at helping myself. But eventually I'm going to start to think, actually, I'm looking in the mirror here, right? Joe's a bit of an idiot when it comes to certain things in life, but so am I. Like, we all do that. We've all got these same biases, right? We're all prone to overestimating risk when we get anxious. Like, we all underestimate risk and act impulsively when we get angry, right? So we all have the same problems. How the hell are we going to deal with that? Well, if we can help other people, we start to learn how to help ourselves. That's why Socrates is more like a psychotherapist, a life coach, or a counselor than people will admit, right? Show me a modern philosopher that engages in dialogue with ordinary people all day long, 7 days a week. What do modern philosophers do? They write books, right? They give lectures. Occasionally, they maybe do a tutorial with a bunch of philosophy students, right? Maybe they go on the radio or something like that, talk about it. But they don't talk to random strangers about their fundamental values all day long, every day, right? Who does do that? Nobody does that. Psychotherapists do it. Coaches do it. Counselors do it, right? So Socrates, in that regard, has more in common with a coach or a counselor or a therapist than he does with a modern academic philosopher. And you can tell he says stuff that would be more recognizable, like, because that's his experience. He talks about ideas that academics talk about, but the way he does philosophy is more like a coaching process or a therapy process. He even refers to it using that kind of language. He says that the Socratic method is like a medicine for the mind. Like he says it's a cure for a certain type of problem. What is the problem that the Socratic method cures? Right? Like, if it's a cure, I think most people are probably a little bit vague about that, but Plato tells us it's a problem that everyone has, right? Plato calls it a very specific problem. He calls it double ignorance, right? Socrates doesn't think that ignorance is a big deal, right? It's not a problem to be ignorant. We're ignorant of lots of things, right? So Socrates might say, I'm pretty ignorant about medicine, right? I'm pretty ignorant about shipbuilding. It's not like that big a deal generally. I mean, there are certain things that I need to know about, but there's loads of things I'm ignorant about. It's not a problem. Suppose I need to do some shipbuilding or I get sick. What am I going to do? Right? I'm ignorant of those topics. Well, as long as I realize that I'm ignorant, I'd either go away and educate myself. I'd be motivated. I think, I know I'm ignorant, and yet I need to know this. I suppose that gives me a motive to learn about it. Or I'd consult an expert, right? And then I'm, like, that's a normal scenario. It's not particularly, as long as I can identify an expert, then, that's a reasonably, and there are reasonable ways of doing that. Like, that's not such a terrible situation. But what would happen if I'm ignorant of medicine, but falsely believe myself to be an expert? What would happen if I'm ignorant about shipbuilding and falsely believe myself to be an expert in shipbuilding? Socrates says, well, then I would be guided by my ignorance, right? Rather than compensating for it. So I'd build a ship that would sink, like, or, I'd give people medicine that's going to do them no good or might even harm them. Even worse, what happens if I become a politician and I start advising the assembly on shipbuilding and medicine, but I'm completely ignorant of the subject, If I'm a politician and I'm ignorant of these things, I might say we need to get some experts in, like, and consult them. That's fine. Like, but if I have double ignorance, if I'm ignorant of my ignorance, if I falsely believe that I know about shipbuilding, I might advise the whole nation incorrectly. Well, now the whole nation is guided by my ignorance, right? Well, do you know that's the norm in modern society? Most politicians know diddly squat about pretty much everything, right? Like most of them are career politicians that know virtually nothing about economics or healthcare, like the military, or like their main focus is just winning votes and stuff like that, right? They haven't often spent that much time studying. I mean, like in America at the moment, like Donald Trump wants to put this guy, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., like who has never studied medical research, has got no training, credentials, or qualifications whatsoever in medicine, has no knowledge or understanding whatsoever of medical research, right? But potentially has a lot of influence over other people's opinions because they pay attention to them, right? Politicians are experts in the art of influencing opinion with regard to subjects that they have no knowledge of themselves. Like, as Plato pointed out, it seems like a crazy scenario. So the Socratic method is designed to cure people of double ignorance. It's a cure for a kind of intellectual conceit. Like, we have assumptions. I assume that I know what justice is, perhaps. Like, Socrates would say to people, you talk a lot about what's right and wrong. You get really angry with people because you think like they're behaving unjustly. But do you know what justice actually is? Have you ever really thought about it? Socrates thought our fear of death was a form of double ignorance. People would say, you're not scared of dying, Socrates. So Socrates would be like, what happens when you die? They say, I don't know. He'd be like, well, like, how can I be? What sense does it make to be frightened? Like, if I don't know whether it's good or bad, it might be the best thing that's ever happened to me. Like, there's something a bit odd about saying that you've got no idea what this thing is. But, so fear of death, he said, is a kind of intellectual conceit, right? Anger. Like, you believe most anger revolves around perceived injustice. All right, what constitutes justice? No idea. Like, so what constitutes injustice? I don't really know how to explain it. Like, so Socrates would say it's a kind of intellectual conceit then that constitutes that lies at the basis of anger. Like, you're assuming that you know something that you do not in fact know. And the Socratic method highlights that. One of the things that Socrates liked to do was to ask people how can a shepherd's able to count sheep? Like, would a shepherd know how many sheep he has? And in ancient Athens, people would say, well, that's an easy question, right? Because this is why they thought he was an idiot, right? They'd be like, that's a dumb question, Socrates, because a shepherd in ancient Athens, as elsewhere in the ancient world, pretty much has one job, right? He's got to count how many sheep he's got and make sure he doesn't lose one, right? That's right. He counts them in, he counts them out. If one's missing, it's fallen off a cliff or a wolf's eaten it or something like that. But he's got one job to do, and that's to make sure he doesn't lose a sheep. In order to do that, he has to count sheep, right? So shepherds are pretty good at counting sheep. They could do it in their sleep, right? So Socrates says, that's interesting. Yeah, you're probably right. He says, what's more important, sheep or friends? And they'd be like, okay, this guy's crazy. Like, he's asking me dumb questions again. They'd be like, Socrates, friends are more important. Everyone agrees that friends are more important than sheep. And so Socrates said, yeah, you're probably right. He says, so how many friends have you got? And they'd be like, well, I don't know. That's a weird question, Socrates. I haven't really thought about it. Like, and he said, why not? And they said, well, sometimes it's hard to know for sure if you classify someone as a friend or not as a friend, right? So I haven't really spent much time thinking about it. And he said, but you said that friends were more important than sheep. Like, and a shepherd would know exactly how many sheep he's got. So how come you don't know how many friends you've got if it's so important? And what he's highlighting is this inconsistency. Our thinking is pervaded by these kind of contradictions. You said this was really important, and yet you spent zero time thinking about it, right? You've never really reflected. Maybe, it's not the thing you would normally reflect on until you reach a point of crisis, and maybe something goes wrong in your life, and suddenly you think, maybe I should get clearer about how I define a friend, like, how I decide whether someone's my friend or not. I guess I was just kind of going with the flow and taking it for granted, and I was a bit fuzzy about, what friendship really means and stuff. until I reached the point of crisis. But Socrates says, you already know this is one of the most important things in life, and you've never made any effort to try and clarify it, right? Those are the sort of contradictions that he was always questioning in people. So there's a kind of intellectual conceit. We go around acting like we know what a friend is, but we don't. We're ignorant. But we don't know that we're ignorant. We're ignorant of our ignorance. So we've got double ignorance about friends. And worse, we've got double ignorance about most things. So Socrates just wanted to make people more aware. We have a kind of blind spot for it. He wanted us to perceive that blind spot and to, begin to refine some of the most important concepts that we use. And he didn't think that we could easily get to a simple definition of these concepts. But by, the Socratic dialogues frustrate people because they often end in aporia, or it means like uncertainty, bewilderment, confusion. But it's the process that matters. For Socrates, I don't think wisdom consists in knowing a bunch of stuff. I don't think wisdom consists in a bunch of opinions. The sophists, these guys that were professional wise men in ancient Athens, they thought, you could acquire wisdom in the same way that you could go to the greengrocers and buy a bag of onions. You could go to sophists, just hand over a bag of money, and they would make you wise by telling you a bunch of stuff. They teach you what to think. They give you a lecture on the nature of justice, and you just have to memorize it. And everyone in Athens at one point was going around repeating stuff that Protagoras, the first major sophist, said. Socrates thought, this is weird. I need to go and talk to this Protagoras guy, because everyone else is going around saying, well, this is what justice is. This is what courage is. And I'm not sure they're right. But if I ask them questions about it, they've got no idea. They go, I don't know, I'm just repeating what this guy said. He's a professional wise man, so he should know, right? This is the same situation that we potentially risk finding ourselves in with AI. Socrates said, what you get from a sophist. Socrates was worried about books. He thought people would read books and get opinions from them rather than genuine understanding. But people are going to read the book and then just repeat what it says. But they won't have gone through the process of trying to figure things out for themselves. So they don't really have genuine knowledge, understanding. They're just parroting stuff, right? Their learning is completely passive. Today, going to listen to a lecture by a sophist, we watch a YouTube video, right? We, reading a book, we maybe just ask AI to tell us the answer to a question, right? And Socrates thought you just get opinions that way. Opinions are pseudo-knowledge. It's the appearance of knowledge rather than genuine knowledge. So for Socrates, genuine wisdom is more of a dynamic process. Being able to do the Socratic method, is wisdom. Wisdom is a cognitive skill. You get it by testing yourself in conversation, almost like sitting lots of it. There's a difference between reading a book and sitting an exam, for example, or sitting a series of exams. This is, people often get a very superficial understanding of subjects like philosophy, for example, just by watching a video or reading a book. You get a different level of understanding by participating in debates, symposia, tutorials, writing papers, doing exams and stuff like that. You start to work through questions. You think you understand something and then people raise questions about it that you can't answer. There's a process involved. And being able to work through that process is what constitutes genuine wisdom, Socrates thought. So he would say, some people say, what would Socrates say if he was alive today? I think people are concerned. There's two ways that we could use AI. One is asking it what we should believe, right? And Socrates would say that's just like going to the sophists. It's exactly the same. So you're just becoming completely passive. You're delegating all of your thinking to someone else, or in this case, to a machine. Or we can debate stuff with AI and use it to kind of refine our thinking skills. So I could come up with an opinion, and then I could ask AI to come up with objections to it that I have to respond to. We could treat it more like a kind of sparring partner or a piece of exercise equipment or something like that. I think society might be coming divided in a sense into the sort of guys that would just go and ask AI what they should believe, and the sort of guys that might use it more as a kind of a way of exercising their thinking skills, their cognitive skills. The fear is we're all going to just become passive and delegate all of our thinking to computers. I think Socrates, if we could travel through time, would say that the fear that we have that might happen with AI, the feared catastrophe has already happened. He said, but that happened centuries ago. It already happened to you guys. Like with the invention of the printing press, like you all had so many books, you could bury someone underneath a pile of them. Like you've got shops full of books, like libraries full of books. For hundreds of years, you guys have been going around just regurgitating stuff that you've read in books. And then off the internet, the radio, the television, and stuff like that. And now you're going to do the same thing with AI. But this passivity, like this kind of pseudo learning, like is already pervaded your society. You know, he saw it as an emerging problem in ancient Athens. But it happened. Like happened centuries ago. We're already, living in a kind of age of passivity and just kind of regurgitating other people's opinions. So I think we need to bring back a greater emphasis on thinking for ourselves. I hate to break it to you kids, you're going to have to think for yourselves. Like, it's what Socrates is basically saying. And that's why they killed him.
Speaking of death, a lot of death chat there. It's quite interesting. So
It's my favourite subject. Who doesn't like death? Like, it's everyone's favourite subject. I'll tell you when it becomes most popular, and I'm not joking, at Christmas, right? People at Christmas love talking about contemplating their own mortality. It's better than speaking to their relatives and things like that. Like it becomes very topical at Christmas. I think that's why they brought that horror film out. Like, it was Nosferatu. They released it on Christmas Day. Yeah, that doesn't surprise me. Like, people at Christmas get really into contemplating their own mortality and thinking about death, like, these kind of ultimate things. So we're just emerging from that now. Like, in the new year and stuff like that, people have come out of that. So we're now tapping into a point where recently many of your listeners will have been contemplating their own mortality over the Christmas dinner.
Well, that makes a good link, because when King George died, the Prime Minister at the time was Winston Churchill, and he said, he had to obviously give a eulogy on the radio, and he said, after a day of sport and surrounded by family, you welcome death as a friend. And I always quite like that, welcome death as a friend. Because Socrates talks so much about it, if we were to look at his philosophy and advice to us in the modern age on how we should approach death.
Well, first of all, Socrates talks about death in Plato's Apology, which I think everyone should read. If you're a fast reader, you can maybe read it in like an hour and a half or something like that. Like, it's the one book that I recommend that everyone should read, because he's about to die. So he contemplates his own mortality. He says some interesting things about it, but he doesn't talk about it extensively. Like, he talks about it a little bit more in Plato's Phaedo, but there's a pseudo-Platonic text called the Axiochus. And by pseudo-Platonic, I mean that it purports to be written by Plato. It's written in his style, but we believe it was, and people in the ancient world believe it was probably written by someone else, maybe one of his students or successors. And the Axiochus is all about death. Like, it's all about contemplating your own mortality. There's a guy who's a friend of Socrates who's dying and freaking out, and Socrates is summoned to come and talk to him and help to console him a bit about his own mortality. So that's where to look for some inspiration in this regard. I mean, many of the arguments that we find in the Axiochus and elsewhere in ancient literature are very old. Some of them are more associated with the Stoics. We see the Stoics really lean. Often in the Socratic dialogues, you get these things that are said in passing, and then the Stoics latch onto them and really develop them more and more. So there are many different things. I'll rattle through. So I don't expect, and even in the ancient world, people were seldom convinced by some of these arguments. But Socrates said it's almost like though you So he said, Socrates said, speaking to the wise sometimes is like being bitten by a small insect, like a midge, right? So you might not even notice when it happens. But then hours later, or maybe even the next day, it starts to itch. And you think, man, something must have bit me. It was probably yesterday when I was wandering about in the middle of nowhere, like looking at a loch or something, or a glen. Like something got me yesterday. And that's what Socrates' students used to say. They'd be like, man, like something's bugging me. And I think it was something Socrates said like a week ago, right? It's kind of been bothering me ever since, right? So at the time, it seemed ridiculous. There's things that I read in Plato's dialogues that seemed trivial, superficial, ridiculous to me. 20 years later, they were still bothering me. Like 30 years later, they still bother me today. So some of the things he says. So Socrates says fear of death is a kind of intellectual conceit. He says, look, there are two possibilities, basically. He says either it's like being unconscious forever, right? Which is neither good nor bad. Like, you would just be unconscious. Like, you wouldn't experience any pain or any happiness. It would be indifferent. It would be like sleeping forever. And so there's no you there to suffer. It's non-existent. So it's kind of, there's a neutrality about it. And some people would say, well, and the Axiochus, the guy he's talking to, is like half convinced by this. And he's like, okay. But like, I'd be deprived of pleasure. There's a lot of nice things in life and I'd be deprived of those. And Socrates, if I was completely unconscious for forever. And Socrates says, but you wouldn't be conscious of the deprivation. You would be unconscious of the deprivation. So what difference does it make? And he's like, okay, they're still seeing something weird about this. Like, and Socrates said, but also you've already been unconscious for an eternity. Before you were born, you didn't exist. And that doesn't bother you. Like, so why should you be bothered about the fact that you'll be non-existent again in the future? This is the argument from symmetry. It's a weird argument, but everyone always remembers it. Like, he says, for an eternity, figuratively speaking, for a quasi-eternity, for almost an eternity, before you were born, you didn't exist, and there was just oblivion. Like, and then in the future, after you're dead, the same thing happens. You're returning to the same state that you were in before you were born, the state of complete and utter non-existence and oblivion and unconsciousness. Like, but you don't worry about it. You don't sit there thinking, man, that really sucked that I was unconscious and non-existent for a gazillion years before I was born. I really resent that. It kind of ruined my childhood, actually. Like, thinking about it. Socrates said, so why would you fear returning to that state of non-existence that doesn't bother you in retrospect? It's an odd argument, but it's an interesting argument. So he says, like, we should be indifferent to non-existence. He said the alternative is that we continue to exist, but we don't know what it's going to be like, right? Now, I think the argument that he implies is that for a philosopher who values wisdom and virtue more than external goods, that in the afterlife, as long as you're conscious, you would be able to continue doing philosophy, right? You'd be able to continue using the Socratic method. You'd be able to continue reflecting on things. And so Socrates says, if I'm conscious and able to continue reasoning in the afterlife, even if the afterlife kind of sucked or whatever, like the external things don't really matter that much to me anyway. Like, what really matters to me more than anything else is the ability to think about things and question them. Like, so I don't know what's going to happen in the afterlife. Either I'm unconscious, in which case I'd be indifferent, or I'd be conscious, in which case, whether it's heaven or hell or purgatory, it doesn't really matter to me as long as I'm able to think about it. I can carry on doing philosophy. And whoever I meet in the afterlife, if I meet anyone, I'd be able to carry on doing the same thing that I do now. Like, so I'd be happy. Like, I'd continue to be fulfilled, is his argument. And those are some of the things that the other philosophers, this view is attributed to Socrates sometimes. And again, it's not a convincing argument to many people, but it kind of sticks with them. The Stoics repeat an argument that is attributed a couple of times to Socrates, but really more associated with the natural philosophers that came before him, which is the idea that death is a natural process. It's really just a change of state. Like they would say, in a sense, you're not really destroyed, just that the molecules in your body are rearranged, and put in a different form. They were materialists, right? They didn't think there was like an immortal spirit. They just think, you're just a bunch of atoms. And they said, just like you could take a piece of wax and mold it into the shape of a little person, you could also squash it flat or mold it into the shape of a horse, but it's like the wax still continues to exist. And so for some people, viewing death as just a natural process of transformation seems to be a consolation. To other people, they're like, well, that doesn't make any difference to me. Like, I'm still worried about the fact that I wouldn't exist. But some people throughout history have found that perspective strangely consoling, right? So you kind of find that idea in Socrates, attributed sometimes to Socrates as well. Those are some of the things that come up in these dialogues.
One of Socrates' famous lines, certainly famous on Instagram captions of men looking awfully muscly, is that no man has the right to be an amateur in the matter of physical training. Do we actually know what their exercise routine was? Plato means broad. We know they wrestled. Do we know much about their workout routine at all?
We know a little bit, but I don't know how much we know about Greek wrestling and the exercise that they followed. Probably more than I. There's probably more information out there than I'm familiar with. I don't think we know a huge amount of it. But I know that our knowledge of Greek wrestling is fairly limited. I've read articles, for example, trying to kind of decipher the posture that they adopt they're shown on the vases. We don't really know for sure. We can see that Greek wrestlers stretch their arms out in front of them, by the way. Here's a bit of trivia for you. So some people have kind of puzzled over that. In the Pancratian, like the mixed martial art they did, they stretched their arms out far ahead of them, which is a slightly unusual, posture. So some people have tried to speculate about why that would be, what it implies about the way that they would fight. But a couple of things that we do know, most Greek men considered that their obligation to, in their youth, undertake physical exercise to prepare them for military service, because they had a citizen army and all adult men were expected, all adult citizens, male citizens were expected to serve in the military. And they would train in the gymnasia to do that. They would wrestle, they would run, they would throw javelins and discus, they would box. And they also did something else. They did a highly stylized militaristic dance. The Romans did similar things as well. I think it seems odd to us, the idea of a military dance, but the closest analogy I can think of is in martial arts. There are these things called patterns or kata, which are stylized versions of the fighting moves. So the Greeks would dance with a shield and a spear, and they would leap and thrust the spear and hold up the shield, in these kind of exaggerated movements, in order to train themselves in strength and flexibility and kind of rehearse some of the movements that they would need to fight as a hoplite in the military. So those are some of the things they do. Socrates also talks about dancing as a form of exercise. But it's hard to, one of the frustrating things I mentioned earlier is in some of the sources we have, we're not really sure how literally we can take them. Socrates often seems to be being ironic or to be joking. So there's, in Xenophon's Symposium, he says he dances every morning as a form of exercise, and he uses both his arms and his legs so that he exercises his arms and legs equally. And his friends seem to think this is funny. But, with the shoemaker, likewise, maybe it's true. And he actually stood there dancing on his own outside his house every day as some kind of physical exercise. But dance was used in the ancient world. But all young men were expected to train in dance and in wrestling. Most of the philosophers that we read had, would have had considerable experience of fighting sports, combat sports, wrestling, stuff like that. And some of them, Cleanthes was a boxer. Chrysippus was a long distance runner, like the second and third heads of the Stoic school. Plato was probably a wrestler, and we believe Socrates must have done these things as well in his youth. But as he got older, it maybe, I think it was viewed that it was more in their youth that Greeks and Romans would do these things, and it was less common for people to participate in some of these exercises as they got older.
As we come to a close, Donald, probably one of his most famous lines, Socrates says that the unexamined life is not worth living, and that it's the purpose of life to examine it. So in your view, is that really true? Surely the continual introspective treadmill gets pretty tiring. And like Epicurus, you just want
He didn't say the continually examined life is the only one worth living. He said that unexamined life is not worth living. The completely unexamined life is not worth living. I think he's, there's an element of truth in that. I think the danger is that we get to that. I mean, look, we pursue certain goals and values in life, and they're seldom the right ones. Like we were saying earlier, the values that we, as children, we just monkey see, monkey do. We copy the values that we see around us in society. Well, we're in deep trouble because those values are consumerism and celebrity culture and materialism and hedonism and stuff like that. Those are the prevailing values of our society, are absurd, contradictory, and pretty unhealthy. It's been like that throughout history, though. So, if we don't examine those and question them, we have no real freedom. We're not really being our authentic selves either. We're living our lives through the lens of other people's goals and values. It would be like you're a kid and your parents say that they think you should become a doctor, and they send you to university to study medicine, and then you spend your life doing it, and you're lying in your deathbed and you're thinking, I only really did that because my parents told me that I had to, I wish I always wanted to be an actor or something like that instead, or a rock musician, or, I wish if I had to redo, I could go back and do it all again. I think it's Euripides in one of his plays that says, everybody should be able to live at least twice. Because the first time, is just a kind of test run, like you're figuring out what it's all about, and then you should get another go at it. I mean, at least twice. You should get at least one redo before you get to go back to the beginning and go do it properly this time. Because, the problem is you don't know what you're supposed to be doing, right? And so your first attempt should be just figuring out what the hell you're supposed to be doing, and then you should get at least one redo where you get to actually do it. Because otherwise what happens is you get to the end of your life and then you're like, I was doing the wrong stuff. I spent my entire life working in that paperclip factory, right? And I look back on it, I think that was a bit of a waste of time. Or, I spent my whole life just heading in the wrong direction. I should have been going right when I was going left the whole time. If I could go back in time, I would have changed course. I would have changed direction. Or I married the wrong woman, or I picked the wrong career, or I did the wrong degree at university. But, we're in a trance. Society hypnotizes us into accepting its prevailing values. The whole game is about waking up from the trance and snapping your fingers. Wake up. And then take a step back and examine your life. If you don't examine your life, then you're living in a trance. And then you pop your clogs and it's too late. You can look back and you think, all right, I wasn't really ever fully alive because I was just on autopilot doing, what I thought I was supposed to be doing. But maybe it was all the wrong stuff. It wasn't really what I valued. I wasn't really flourishing. Like, the only chance that you have to course correct is to snap your fingers, snap out of the trance. And usually, like I said, that only happens if you think you're about to die, right? Or maybe if you're bereaved or something like that. Or you're watching, or maybe if you're listening to this podcast and we've said enough things to freak people out, scare them out.
Every 20 minutes, I'm dead.
Snap them out of it, give them a bit of a shake, and then they maybe sit back and think, maybe I've been doing this all wrong. You're right. Maybe I should have my redo now. Change my mind, change my values, change my priority. Maybe I should be thinking about this and deciding for myself what my values actually are, rather than just going along with a herd, like some kind of lemming. Because the herd are all about to walk off a cliff, right? They don't know where they're going. They're in a stupor. You've got to snap out of it or question the prevailing. The Cynics used to symbolize this. The Cynics did a lot of weird stuff. Socrates was pretty weird. The Cynics were even weirder. They would allegedly walk backwards. When everybody was coming out of the theatre, they would walk in the opposite direction and people would bump into them. A bit like that. That video with the Verve? Which one is it? Where he's walking down the street, Richard Ashcroft's walking down the street in London and people keep bumping into him, right? He's like a cynic philosopher, right? They would practice walking in the wrong direction. Everyone would bump into them and yelling at them and stuff like that. And in a way, they're practicing what they call shamelessness, so that they become kind of indifferent to people being upset or criticizing them. But it was also deeply symbolic. They were practicing this idea of getting used to rejecting the prevailing values of society. The Cynics rejected materialism. They rejected the pursuit of reputation very radically, and people made fun of them. That's why they're called the Cynics. People said, "You're like dogs. You're scum," right? They mocked them, but they embraced that. They said, "Yeah, you're right. Because we don't share your values. We don't think it's important." The famous anecdote, and this is probably apocryphal, but the Alexander the Great met Diogenes the Cynic. Everyone knows the story. And Diogenes lived in people say a barrel, but it would have been barrels didn't exist in ancient Greece, right? So it would have been like a big ceramic urn. They use these huge, big ceramic, like a big, gigantic vase to store oil and stuff like that. And so it would have been like this. It would be like today, the equivalent of living in a cargo container or something like that. So he got inside this and he lived in it. He lived in poverty. He'd go around naked. He didn't have any possessions. And Alexander the Great, the most powerful man in the world, met him and said, "Listen, is there anything that I can do for you?" And Diogenes famously said, "Yeah, can you step aside? You're blocking the sun." And this is meant to symbolize the fact that he didn't give two hoots. He's like, "I don't care about your values, and you're conquering Persia and all that kind of stuff. It doesn't mean anything to me." The legend is that Alexander the Great conquered Persia and he was like a god. He founded more cities than anyone in history. And some people say that at the end of it, he kind of began to realize that it didn't mean anything. There's a legend that when Alexander was dying, he said, "I want you to take my casket and cut 2 holes in it on either side." And his friends were like, "Well, why the hell would you want to do that?" He goes, "I want you to stick my arms out them. Because my arms are hanging out." I said, "The casket," right? And normally they would carry the casket parade it through the streets so everybody could see this is body Alexander Great. And then they said, "Well, why would you do that?" And he goes, "I want everybody to see that my hands are empty. Like we say today, you can't take it with you." He's like, "I want everybody to see that I'm going to my grave empty-handed, even though I conquered." Now, that's probably just a legend, a myth. But maybe like Simon the Shoemaker, for all we know, it might actually be real, right? I'd love to think it is real, because that would suggest that earlier in his life, Alexander met Diogenes the Cynic. Supposedly, as he walked away, people were laughing and thinking, "This guy Diogenes is an idiot," right? And someone like asked Alexander about it, and he said, if I wasn't Alexander, like I would like to have been Diogenes. Like, so maybe throughout his life, that kind of like the mosquito bite, the midgie bite, as he walked away from Diogenes, he thought, what was that crazy old guy on about? But then it kind of started to bug him, like as he was conquering Persia, and kind of ate away at him a bit. He started to think, now I have everything. Like people think I'm like a god, but he was like, but is this really what life is meant to be about? Who cares? Like, if people worship me, like, who cares? Like, how much gold I've got, or how many cities I've founded. Like, these guys care about it a lot. Historians care a lot about it. But does it really matter that much? It's like, I can't take any of it with me. Yeah. Marcus Aurelius said Alexander the Great and the guy that cleaned up after his donkey, like, both ended up in the same place. Like, they're both dust. Like, it said death is the great leveler. Like, during his life, Alexander did amazing, remarkable things, but Marcus Aurelius says, I don't admire him. Like, I have much more admiration for Diogenes, like, because he was actually enlightened. Socrates and people like that, they weren't rich, like, they weren't powerful, like, but they transcended the need for wealth and power. Like, so you might think, wow, that's easy for you guys to say, sitting there with a stripy tie, like,
hey, leave the tie alone.
And yeah, and your nice warm houses and stuff like. But I do think, we have to question things. Like, I mean, honestly, we're surrounded by propaganda and rhetoric. Like, that's the sole job of many people, is to kind of go around trying to brainwash other people. They want you to buy an iPhone. Like, they want you to watch the latest movies. They want you to subscribe to everything. Like, they want you to envy rich people. They want you to look at Elon Musk and think, I wish I was that guy. Right? Like, they want you to look at Alexander the Great and think, I wish I was that guy. But, I mean, are these people really happy? Like, and if they are, I mean, are they genuinely flourishing, like, and fulfilled? I think it's actually, in Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, Diogenes, Socrates, one of the things they all agree about is it's difficult to flourish when you're surrounded by material success, because everybody wants a piece of you, right? And you end up living for other people. Like, if you want to be the CEO of a company, like, you want to be famous, if you want to be highly acclaimed, you have to pander to some extent to other people. You've got to sell out, potentially, like, in order to get that amount of acclaim. But it's not really satisfying at the end of life. I don't know. I mean, you're in an interesting position. Your background is cycling, right? And we were talking earlier about how I've spoken to a number of athletes and sportsmen over the years. And I know people feel differently about this, but, I always wonder, sometimes I've spoken to people that have been at the top of their game in some sport, whatever, like they're an Olympic gold medalist, or they're like, they've won some big championship or whatever. And then they're like, over time they retire, and they're like, they get into commenting or coaching, or they're kind of like, their life moves on and stuff like that. And most people would look at them and think, man, I wish I was an Olympic gold medalist. That would be awesome, right? But I don't think everybody that achieves those things looks back on it later in life and necessarily, feels that it was actually what they wanted. Like, sometimes I think people look back on it and think there's good things and bad things about it. Like, sometimes they look back on like material success or sporting success or acclaim and think, man, I had to really dedicate 20 years of my life to that. And I look back on it now and maybe I kind of wish that I'd done something else. Like, it's not always the right decision for everybody. And some people I've met over the years, other people would look at them and really envy their success. But when you ask them, they're a bit kind of meh about it. Like, well, I won a bunch of medals and trophies and stuff, but like, I don't know if that really matters that much in the grand scheme of things. Like maybe I there's other things that I would have rather been, like doing in my life. I think it's especially the case when you have to dedicate everything. Like, and maybe in some people's cases where if you really want to be the top of something, you've got to sacrifice stuff. Sportsmen in particular, and businessmen are always going on about you have to make sacrifices, right? What do you have to sacrifice? Well, in some sports, you have to sacrifice your health, right? You might have to sacrifice your relationships. Like, you want to be really successful. Sometimes Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, these guys, certainly for part of their life at the beginning, like work 7 days a week and don't take holidays. Like, you potentially have to sacrifice your social life, your family life. Maybe you'll never see your kids much. Like, and those kind of things really hit people. Like, I think later in life, they go, wow, like I was really successful in my 20s and 30s. But in retrospect, I kind of wish that I'd just been able to spend more time with my friends and family, like, and talk to my kids more. Like, people's values change. And what seems like obvious success from the outside, it's not always like that when you talk to people about it. Like, there are many people, who might be a famous musician, highly successful sportsman, wealthy CEO. Like, if they were given a second attempt, like a redo, they might do it completely differently. And yet we have it drummed into us, like we're supposed to revere, like, and want to emulate people that succeed in different walks of life. I think, you have to decide for yourself. We all have to question those assumptions, and really reflect on our values. Like, we have to think about what it is, that we really admire about other people, and what it is that we would, when we look in the mirror, what it is that we would be able to see looking back at us that would give us a sense of genuine satisfaction and fulfillment, when we're lying on our deathbed, looking back on the life that we've lived. It's not easy. Like, it's difficult. It's a constant battle. We're always kind of like questioning things, maybe pivoting in our lives, discovering new things. But I think partly by talking to other people, like, it can help us to, like I said earlier, gain some perspective. Everybody from time to time in their life has these sudden, like, epiphanies, like, where you think, hang on a minute, like, maybe I was wrong all these years. Like, Socrates was once talking to Protagoras, was called the wisest man alive by his followers. He was the first sophist, a professional wise man. And these guys trained students how to win debates. Like, everything they did, they made a fortune by training people to win arguments. Protagoras became fabulously wealthy. But he was very, very wealthy because his whole reputation, his whole status, turned on his ability to teach people how to win arguments. And Socrates said to him, if you're anything like me, you'd be the kind of guy that prefers to lose an argument than win it. And Protagoras was like, what on earth are you talking about, you weird old dude? Like, you weird guy. Like, what are you on about? And Socrates said, well, in a debate about philosophy, and this is true of many other subjects as well, the person that wins the debate gains nothing of any real value. Like, maybe they get a round of applause, but who cares, But the person that loses a debate about the most important things in life learns something. Like, and so they benefit the most. The irony is, you should want to lose debates about the most important things in life. You might actually gain thereby and learn something. And that, I think, is typically ironic, typically parody. That's Socrates in a nutshell, buddy. That's all you need to know about the guy. I could have saved you an hour and a half.
Donald, you have been a delight funny, engaging, insightful. Thank you very much for taking an hour and 40 out of your busy day to want us to show.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.